Anything else about injury? I mean, you've written a lot about this in terms of different, competing theories around injury. And how much do you think it varies by sport? And I guess most importantly, what is the implication for people who tend to get injured in life? Not, they're walking down the street and they pull a calf muscle versus they're, out there doing their tempo run.
Yeah. So I've been, willingly or unwillingly embroiled in lots of debates about injuries over the last decade and a half. And a lot of them focus on things like running shoes, the proper running form, is the height of your insole going to affect your risk of injury? And that stuff's fun. And it's not zero impact, but I think to me, there's a guy named Ben O'Nig, who's a sort of famous biomechanist, who's done a lot of work on running injuries and stuff. And his take in one of his studies was that, look, 80% of running injuries are what he would call training, are originally a result of what he would call training errors. So yeah, it's nice. There's 20% to work with on, shoes or whatever, prehabilitation and balance, yada, yada, yada. Most of what we need to worry about is doing too much too soon. That's and that's an oversimplification, but certainly when we're talking about overuse injuries, I'm not talking about like getting tackled on the football field. So, I mean, I really think, especially for people who are starting out or ramping up an exercise program, just that patience is so important, and that understanding that you will probably overestimate what you can accomplish in the short term, and you'll probably underestimate what you can accomplish in the long term. But if you do, and if you fall into that trap, you're dramatically raising your injury risk because you're going to try and ramp up too quickly. Because again, you can gain metabolic fitness more quickly than you can alter the structure of your joints and ligaments and things like that. So, I mean, that's if there's one takeaway message, it would be like, it's not about the magical gadget or the new way of running or the measuring device. It's like, just be patient, be smart. You get home, you have something that's aching. You don't want to miss the next day's session, and you don't want to become. It's always a balance, right? Between am I being lazy or am I being safe? Well, you want to err on the side of safe, certainly, until you start getting a better handle on which aches and pains are normal and which ones aren't. I mean, there's a whole nother. We can get into things like, balance training or training load monitoring.
Well, let's talk about acute versus chronic load training. I mean, I used to have a program called Training Peaks that would track this for me. So it saw every single day how many miles I rode, and it actually did it more by kilojoules than miles. So it was total energy expenditure. But if you were giving someone some guidance, some rules of thumb, if they were becoming active, and we don't have to get into the formulas, but just using the principles of acute versus chronic load balance, how would you help them think through everything you just said with these metrics?
So the background is that the rule of thumb that they used to teach runners is the 10% rule. Never increase your mileage more than 10%. And it's a rule that makes no sense at the margins. So like if you start by running 1 mile, then you're never going to get above 5 miles in your lifetime or whatever. But basically the idea is trying to avoid the too much too soon problem. Now, this idea of an acute to chronic workload ratio is a sort of more sophisticated version of that. And the idea is, how much are you doing now versus how much is your body used to? And the way that the papers, the academic papers do it is, what's your weekly load, whether you do it in joules or miles or minutes, and what's your average weekly load over the last 4 weeks? And this is when they started publishing this. I was like, hey, I designed my own training log back in the 90s and printed it out. And that's the two things I had at the bottom was kilometers that week and 4-week average kilometers. And it's not because it gives Why did you settle on 4 weeks, by the way, as opposed to 3 weeks or 5 weeks? How did you arrive at that? Do you remember? Yeah, there was no deep thinking involved. It was basically a week versus a month. And you can argue it that you need at least you need a decent amount of time, because otherwise you have 1 week where you miss a couple of days due to injury, and then all of a sudden your 4-week average is totally skewed. Mm-hmm. Or if it's a 3 week, or something. And 5 weeks, 6 weeks, at a certain point, you're moving so far back that your body no longer cares what you were capable of doing 8 weeks ago, or at least not as much. So 4 weeks, it's just that it's kind of if you've done something for 4 weeks in a row, and you're feeling okay, then you kind of assume that, yeah, your body's able to handle that load. And so then this allows you, it's just a quick way of seeing if there's any deviations. It's like, oh, this week I did 50% more than my 4-week average. That's a bad sign. Yeah. It doesn't mean you're going to get injured. There's all sorts of contextual things you have to consider in it. But having that as one input into your larger matrix of all the things that you're considering, like, do I feel any aches and pains? What's my absolute load? Not just the ratio, but is this more than I've ever done before? You consider all those things. And I think that acute to chronic ratio, or just to put it more simply, keeping track of how hard you're going now versus how hard you've been going in the previous month, or how much you've been doing, let's say, is useful. Now, I should add that there's controversy in the literature. There's a bunch of people who say that the supposed predicted value of acute to chronic workload ratio is a statistical artifact. It may be, it may not be. I'm not too worried about that. To me, this is not about statistical predictive power. It's just about keeping an eye on trends, and it's knowing if you're way out of whack with what you've been doing before. And as a general rule, let's say if you're 20% higher, that's a time to start making sure you know what you're doing.
Yeah, or just and backing it off maybe that next week.
Yeah, I mean, I unless you have some compelling reason to think that you can handle that, if you're exceeding 20%, then probably be cautious and ideally back off.